What if a billionaire had 90 days to find a wife, or lose everything his father left behind? And what if the woman who agreed to save him was the one person who refused to fall for him? Henry Whitmore never wanted love. He wanted legacy, control, silence. But when his late father's will demands marriage before his 50th birthday or forfeiture of the company, Henry is forced into the one arrangement he swore he'd never make. Enter Clara Monroe, a quiet designer with nothing to prove and everything to protect. She doesn't want fame. She doesn't want his money. She just wants a chance to build something of her own, far from the spotlight. But what begins as a contract soon blurs into something neither of them expected. Stolen glances, quiet confessions, a truth neither one is ready to admit. Is it still pretending? If it starts to feel real, and what happens when old betrayals rise, threatening to break them before they ever begin? If you've ever believed that the deepest love stories begin with doubt, not desire, then this one is for you. Like this video, share it with someone who still believes in second chances, and subscribe to Shining Stories, where real love speaks quietly, but leaves a mark that never fades. Now, let's begin. The rain hadn't let up for hours. It drummed steadily on the wide windows of the Whitmore & Coast Tower, a rhythmic reminder that time was slipping through Henry Whitmore's fingers. The city of Asheville, wrapped in gray mist, blurred beneath the glass. But Henry wasn't looking at it. His eyes were fixed on a single sheet of paper in front of him. The ink had long dried, but its weight pressed on him more heavily than anything he had built in his 25 years as CEO. He leaned back in the leather chair, hands steepled under his chin, the sharp line of his jaw clenched. His silver hair, usually neat, was slightly tousled, unusual for a man known for control. Every thread of his tailored vest was perfectly aligned, yet the document on his desk was unraveling something far deeper. It was his father's will, and the final clause was the one Henry had refused to acknowledge for over a decade. Should my son, Henry Caldwell Whitmore, remain unmarried past his 50th birthday, the primary controlling shares of Whitmore & Co. shall be redistributed to the Board of Trustees, effective immediately. He had read it 100 times, and still, the words hadn't changed. Neither had the deadline. 50, a number he had once laughed at, a milestone he believed would arrive with ease, solitude, and success. But now, it loomed just 3 months away. He would lose everything, everything he had rebuilt after his father's death, after the scandal, after the betrayal that had nearly destroyed the family name. His hands curled slightly into fists, not out of rage, but resistance. Because deep down, the man who had survived hostile takeovers and press storms now stood at the mercy of a clause designed to protect a legacy, a clause written by a man who died believing his son had no heart left to give. And maybe he hadn't. Not since Eliza. Not since the woman he had once loved leaked their spring collection to competitors and watched the empire collapse from the inside out. Not since the night his father collapsed from the stress and never woke again. Henry stood abruptly, crossing to the window. The streets below were glowing wet with rain and lit by the soft flicker of street lamps. Somewhere down there, life went on as if his world weren't silently crumbling. A knock on the door pulled him from the spiral. "Come in," he said, voice even, controlled. It was Eleanor Hart, his late father's oldest friend, and now the company's legal counsel. She entered quietly, carrying a folder and an expression that suggested this conversation wasn't going to be any easier than the one they'd had last week. "You've got options," she said, placing the folder on the table. "Unorthodox ones, maybe, but options." He didn't look at the folder. "I don't want a loophole." "Then what do you want?" Henry was silent for a long moment. "I want to protect what's mine." Eleanor exhaled. "Then you need a wife. Or someone who can play the part well enough at least until the board settles down." He gave a humorless chuckle. "A marriage for show. That's what it's come to." Eleanor met his gaze. "Henry, the board is circling. They think you're emotionally unavailable, isolated. If you don't settle this before your birthday, they'll move in, and you know who's behind that push." He did. Raymond Calder, a board member with old money and even older grudges. He had always resented the Whitmore legacy, always whispered that Henry was too cold, too calculating to lead. And now, Raymond had proof. A man who had never married, never even dated publicly since the scandal. Now on the verge of losing the company, not because of poor leadership, but because of the ghost of a promise to a dying father. Henry returned to his desk and opened the folder. Inside were profiles, women, candidates, all carefully selected, socialites, PR managers, heiresses with something to gain. He closed it without reading past the first page. "Find me someone who doesn't care about money," he said quietly. "Someone who won't ask questions." Eleanor raised a brow. "That narrows it down. Then start there." She left without further comment. Henry leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and let his hands fall to the document once more. The will didn't ask him to fall in love. It asked him to marry. There was a difference, a significant one. But what it hadn't accounted for, what he hadn't accounted for, was that maybe, just maybe, some parts of his heart weren't as locked away as he believed. And in 3 months, he would find out whether that mattered, or whether it was already too late. Henry Whitmore hadn't spoken much during them. He had buried himself in the mechanics of the company meetings, reports, budget sheets, anything to drown out the silent countdown in his mind. But on the 4th evening, just as the sky dipped into a muted amber hue over Asheville, Eleanor called. "I found someone," she said without preamble. "You're not going to like this, but you'll want to hear it." Henry raised an eyebrow. "That's an unusual way to start a pitch. She's not from any of the circles you'd expect. She's not wealthy. She's not connected to the media. She has no interest in playing the part of a billionaire's bride. Then why would she agree to it? She has a debt and a story." Henry exhaled, letting the pause stretch. "Bring her in. She'll be at your office in 20 minutes. When the call ended, he stood by the window again, watching the city blur into golden gray. He didn't know what he expected: a woman in pearls and posture, someone trained in the art of charm and calculated seduction. But when the elevator chimed and the glass door opened, Clara Monroe was nothing like that. She stepped in without hesitation, her presence quiet but grounded. A faded green coat clung to her shoulders, damp from the drizzle outside. Her boots were worn but clean. Her dark auburn hair was pulled into a low twist, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She looked around the room briefly, not to admire the luxury, but as if mapping exits. Henry stood, motionless. She turned her eyes to him. Calm, observant, unshaken. "You're Henry Whitmore." It wasn't a question. More like a statement of challenge. "And you're Clara Monroe." She gave a faint nod. "Eleanor said you needed help with a public image problem. I figured this wasn't about marketing analytics." Henry motioned to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." Clara walked with a quiet confidence. Not arrogance, but the kind of poise earned from surviving things most people never talk about. Once seated, she reached into her tote bag and pulled out a manila folder. "These are the last 3 years of freelance projects I've worked on, mostly design, some concept campaigns, one nonprofit rebrand." Henry didn't open it. He studied her instead. "Why would a woman like you agree to something like this?" Clara didn't blink. "Because I don't need to love someone to respect their boundaries, and because I don't mind pretending if the terms are clear and the timeline is short." Her voice was even, almost too calm. But something flickered in her eyes, a guardedness, as if she had spent years protecting a truth too fragile to share. Henry leaned back in his chair. "What do you want in return?" She hesitated, just slightly. "There's a property I want to buy. For a shelter project I've been building toward for a while. The current owner won't take partial payments." He raised an eyebrow. "You're not asking for $1 million home in the hills." "No," Clara replied, her tone flat. "Just a roof for people who haven't had one." Henry didn't respond right away. He studied her hands. They were steady, not manicured, but not careless either. She wasn't here to impress. She was here for a transaction. "Have you done this before?" he asked. Pretended. She tilted her head slightly. "Once, to get a job I wasn't qualified for. I learned fast. And you'd be willing to fake a marriage? Clara looked him in the eye. I've seen worse arrangements sold as love. The room was still. Outside, the sun had dipped further, casting the sky into soft indigo. Henry looked away briefly, a shadow flitting across his features. This was madness. But then again, so was losing the company because of an old man's dying wish. He turned back to her. You'll have to sign an NDA. The press will be relentless. We'll stage a public relationship. Timeline 3 months, ending with a clean break. No interference in my private affairs. Clara nodded once. Understood. No interviews. No posts. You don't talk to reporters. You show up. You smile. You wear the ring. A pause. I don't wear rings, she said softly. Henry raised a brow. Then you'll learn. He stood, signaling the meeting was over. Eleanor will send over the documents. Clara rose to her feet. She wasn't tall, but she carried herself like someone who didn't need to be. As she reached the door, she turned slightly. You're not what I expected either, she said. Henry's voice was quiet. That makes 2 of us. She left without another word, and for the first time in years, Henry stood alone in his office, unsure if the storm outside had just ended or just begun. The contract was 12 pages long. Henry read every word of it twice before handing the pen to Clara Monroe. She didn't hesitate. She flipped through the pages quickly, eyes scanning with focused calm, and signed her name at the bottom of each section without flinching. No theatrics, no second thoughts, just quiet, deliberate commitment. She slid the pen back across the marble table in his office. Their fingers didn't touch, but something shifted in the space between them, something almost audible in its tension. Effective today, she said. We're engaged. Henry folded the papers, placed them back in the folder, and set it aside like he was shelving a part of himself. It's a transaction, he reminded her. Clara nodded. Standing. I don't confuse stories with real life, but the way she looked at him, steady, unreadable, made him wonder if she believed that fully. Eleanor arranged the first public appearance, within 48 hours, a gallery benefit in the historic district. Henry hadn't been seen at such events in years. But now, his name was trending, billionaire bachelor finally taken. They arrived together, but said little in the car. Clara stared out the window, fingers toying with a bracelet she'd picked from the stylist's curated selection. Henry glanced at her only once, long enough to notice she wasn't wearing heels, just black flats, practical, silent. I don't do small talk, she said quietly, eyes still on the window. Good, Henry replied. Neither do I. When they stepped out under the camera lights, Henry's arm instinctively moved to her back. She didn't flinch, but she also didn't lean in. The photographers shouted, the flashes popped like thunder, and somewhere between the shutter clicks, Clara turned her head toward him and whispered, You don't smile much, do you? Henry smirked, eyes forward. I smile when it matters. The evening passed in curated introductions and polite nods. Clara didn't try to charm. She didn't laugh too loudly. She simply observed, interjected when appropriate, and left a quiet impression wherever she went. By the end of the night, they had trended on 3 major platforms: Whitmore Monroe Power in Silence, The Last Bachelor Falls, back at the penthouse. Clara walked toward the guest room Eleanor had arranged. She paused at the threshold. You don't have to pretend now, she said. The photographers are gone. I'm not pretending, Henry answered from across the hall. This is who I am. Clara turned, watching him for a beat. Then maybe that's the real problem. Her door clicked shut. Henry stood alone for a moment, her words looping in his mind. He didn't get rattled easily, but something about her unnerved him. She didn't flatter, didn't bend. She didn't treat him like a project, a prize, or a paycheck. She treated him like a puzzle, and not one she was particularly interested in solving. Over the next week, they followed the PR script: photos at a local charity, a walk through the fall gardens of Biltmore Estate, a spontaneous coffee shop stop captured by conveniently placed photographers, each scene meticulously staged, each smile carefully placed. But something started happening between the silences. Clara asked real questions, Why did your father put the marriage clause in the will? Henry paused before answering. Because he thought I'd build an empire and forget to build a life. Was he wrong? Henry didn't answer. She didn't press. One night, just past midnight, Henry couldn't sleep. The city had quieted to a distant hum, and he wandered into the kitchen, expecting silence. Clara was there, barefoot, wrapped in an oversized cardigan, staring into the open fridge. Looking for something, he asked. Voice lower than usual. Something sweet, she said without looking at him. But not sugary. He pulled out a tin from the freezer. Frozen cherries, my one weakness. She blinked. You eat fruit. He offered the tin. She took one, cautiously, then another. You surprise me sometimes, she said, chewing slowly. Henry leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You surprise me constantly. They stood like that for a while, passing cherries in silence. Not lovers, not strangers. Something else, something unspoken. But even as the connection deepened, Henry couldn't stop the internal tug of war. Every moment that felt real, he questioned it. Every smile Clara gave, he wondered if it was rehearsed. He told himself it was just a deal, a facade, a performance. But when Clara laughed softly, just once, at a comment he hadn't meant to be funny, Henry felt something dangerous bloom in his chest, something dangerously close to hope. And that scared him more than anything. Autumn had arrived in Asheville. The air was crisp, sharp enough to sting the skin, and the leaves that lined the driveway of Whitmore & Co. crunched underfoot like faded echoes of something once alive. Inside the showroom, the energy hummed. Designers scattered sketches across tables, samples pinned to mannequins, fabric bolts stacked in nervous towers. But despite the controlled chaos, it was Clara Monroe who caught Henry's eye that morning. She was standing quietly near a mood board, her fingers trailing along a piece of hand-dyed wool. She wasn't taking photos. She wasn't speaking. She was simply observing. Her stillness contrasted with the motion around her, yet she didn't seem out of place. She seemed necessary. Henry didn't say anything. He only watched her until one of the senior designers rushed to his side with a swatch and pulled him back into the current. By noon, the showroom had emptied for lunch, and Clara remained behind. Henry found her at the cutting table, red pen in hand, circling inconsistencies on a set of mock-up designs. You're not on payroll, he said. Clara didn't look up. Neither is my eye for detail. He moved closer, scanning the sheet. She had caught a symmetry flaw in the collar design subtle, but it would have cost them once the photos hit print. I studied architecture for a year, she said casually, sensing his question, before I realized I hated concrete and liked fabric better. Henry folded his arms, leaning against the table. You never mentioned that. You never asked. There it was, again, her quiet defiance. Not rebellion, not resistance, but a refusal to be cornered. What else haven't you told me? Clara finally looked at him. The pause stretched, enough to keep this deal interesting. The rest of the afternoon passed in tense silence. Tense not because they fought, but because something was shifting, and neither of them wanted to name it. That night, Clara wandered into the small workroom on the third floor, a private space Henry rarely let others into. But the door was ajar. She stood there for a moment, unsure. Inside, sketches lined the walls. Old ones, rough, beautiful. They were clearly Henry's. When he entered and saw her there, he didn't raise his voice. He only said, "No one comes in here." Clara turned slowly. "You drew all of these I used to," he said quietly. Before what? He didn't answer right away. His voice dropped a register. Before people started stealing what I created. Her gaze softened. "I'm not here to steal from you." Henry met her eyes. "No, you're here to marry me. Temporarily." He turned away, but not fast enough to hide the flicker in his expression. Clara moved closer, carefully. "You think I have a motive, don't you? A beat. I have reasons," she said, "but that's not the same." The quiet returned, but it wasn't cold. This time, it felt like standing at the edge of something fragile. That weekend, They attended a private preview event in Charlotte. A new partnership was being announced, and the board expected Henry to make an appearance with Clara at his side. The moment they entered, whispers began. "She's too plain. She's hiding something. She doesn't belong here." Clara heard every word. She didn't react, but Henry did. During a speech, he reached for her hand. It was unscripted, unapproved, and completely off-brand. Her fingers curled slightly in surprise, but she didn't pull away. Later, when they were alone again, she asked, "Why did you do that?" Henry didn't answer right away. Then, with uncharacteristic softness, "Because they don't get to decide who belongs beside me." Clara stared at him, unsure of what to do with the emotion that rose so suddenly in her chest. Back in Asheville, the following morning brought a storm. Not rain, but an email. Anonymous, untraceable, a photo. Clara, standing at a street corner in Charleston 6 months ago, talking to a man with a face blurred out. The subject line read, "You don't know who you're marrying." Henry stared at the screen, then at the woman now living just down the hall. The doubt didn't strike like lightning. It arrived slowly, like a fog creeping under the door. It wasn't on the itinerary. Henry had told Clara they'd be heading to a vineyard in northern Asheville for a charity shoot. She didn't question it. She packed accordingly: simple clothes, boots, no press-ready dresses. But the car turned off the highway too early. The road narrowed, the forest thickened. Then the trees gave way to a vast clearing, where time seemed to have stopped. A wide field stretched toward a white-painted farmhouse, worn but standing. Its porch sagged slightly, windows weathered by years of rain and silence. Clara sat up straighter in the passenger seat. "This isn't a vineyard," she said softly. "No," Henry replied. "It's something else." The driver parked, and Henry stepped out first. He stood still for a moment, the wind tugging lightly at his coat, before walking toward the porch. Clara followed, her footsteps muffled by the fallen leaves. "My father built this place with his own hands," Henry said, voice low. She turned to him. "You grew up here." He nodded. "Until I left. I only came back once, for the funeral." She didn't ask whose. She didn't need to. Inside, dust hung in the air like memory. The floor creaked underfoot, and Clara's fingers brushed along the edge of a piano covered in a white sheet. "Why bring me here?" she asked after a while. Henry stood by the fireplace, staring into ashes that hadn't been warm in years. "Because this is the one place no one pretends," he said. "There's nothing to perform here. No cameras, no eyes." She turned slowly. "You trust me enough to see this part of you?" His jaw clenched. "No, but I'm tired of hiding from ghosts." They walked through the kitchen. Faded wallpaper, a cracked photograph on the counter, a younger version of Henry with a man whose smile was warm. "If tired." Clara picked it up carefully. "You look like him," she said. "I'm nothing like him." Henry muttered, but there was pain in the way he said it, not anger guilt. Clara placed the photo back down. "You're wrong. You came back." They spent the afternoon in quiet. Clara made tea with the last of the old leaves she found in a cabinet. They didn't speak much, and they didn't need to. The silence was filled with something heavier than words. At sunset, Clara wandered out to the barn. She found a stack of old sketchbooks, charcoal smudges, early designs, even some unfinished patterns that bore the beginning of the style Whitmore & Co. would become famous for. But they were different, more human, less polished. She traced a page and whispered, "You were an artist before you were an executive." Henry had appeared behind her. "I used to believe in beauty without cost." What changed that he looked past her, into the wooden walls of the barn like they still held echoes? Eliza. Her name landed between them like frost. "She didn't just steal my designs," he continued. "She told me she loved me while doing it." Clara didn't move. "I gave her this," Henry said, holding up a simple brass bracelet from a workbench corner. "I made it for her. She left it here the night she walked away." A pause. She said it wasn't worth much. He placed it back down gently. Later that evening, they lit a small fire in the hearth. Clara sat on the rug, legs crossed, sipping her tea. Henry leaned against the wall, one hand in his pocket. "I used to think success meant control," he said. "Now, I'm not sure what it means." Clara looked at him, eyes soft. "Maybe it just means not letting the past define who you become." He met her gaze. For a moment, something settled between them, not quite warmth, not quite trust, but something like recognition. Then Clara said quietly, "There's something I haven't told you either." Henry tensed. Clara looked into the fire. "I knew who you were, before Eleanor ever called me." Silence. "I grew up in Charleston," she said. "My mother worked in a textile mill. We had nothing." She used to speak about this company, Whitmore & Co., like it was a cathedral. Once, she got laid off. No notice, no severance. She collapsed outside your father's warehouse from exhaustion. Henry didn't move. Clara turned to him, voice steady. "Your father found her. He gave her a job. He brought her food that night. That act kept us from going under." Her voice lowered. "I never forgot his name. Or yours." Henry stared at her, the weight of the moment pressing into his chest. "So this," he began. "No," she said firmly. "This wasn't revenge or guilt." "I said yes, because I owed your family a debt I couldn't pay with money." She paused. "But I didn't expect you. A beat. I didn't expect to care." The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows. Henry looked down, his voice barely a whisper. "Neither did I." The storm rolled in around midnight. Not thunder or lightning, not rain on the roof of the old farmhouse, but a storm made of silence, of breath held, of doubt unfurling, inch by inch, until it filled the room like smoke. Henry lay awake on the old leather sofa, staring at the cracked ceiling above him. The fire had long since turned to embers, but its glow still danced across the wooden floor. In the other room, Clara slept. Or at least, he thought she did. He hadn't asked. He didn't want to, because if she wasn't asleep, she might hear the questions clawing their way through his chest. Earlier that evening, he'd received a text from Raymond Calder, brief and acidic. "Still think she's not playing you. Thought you should see this." Attached was a photo, blurry, but clear enough. Clara, weeks before their deal, in Charleston, standing outside a familiar building, Calder Textiles. One of Whitmore & Co.'s oldest rivals and the only one who stood to gain if Henry lost his majority stake. The timestamp was 2 days before she had accidentally met Eleanor. Henry stared at it for too long, long enough for it to plant roots, long enough for the ghosts to return. "She's different," he told himself. "She's not Eliza." But the old ache pressed in anyway, because Eliza had said she wasn't like the others, too. By morning, the farmhouse was silent. Henry brewed coffee mechanically. The old drip machine hissed and gurgled, but it was a sound he barely registered. His mind was already elsewhere. Clara stepped into the kitchen barefoot, hair pulled into a loose knot, cardigan wrapped around her shoulders. She looked soft, honest, which made it worse. She poured herself a cup and sat across from him without a word. For a few moments, they just drank in silence. Then Henry spoke, his voice low, tight. "You've been to Calder Textiles." Clara stilled, her fingers curled slightly around the ceramic mug. "Yes," she said finally. Henry's jaw clenched. "Before or after Eleanor called you?" Clara met his eyes. "Before." He exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in confirmation. "So you lied?" "No," she said calmly. "I just didn't tell you everything. That's not how trust works." Her voice stayed steady. "Neither is pretending to know someone in 3 weeks." He stood up, walking to the window, the coffee cup in his hand, trembling slightly. "You were supposed to be clean," he muttered, "unattached. No ties. That's why I let you in. And I didn't know I was signing up for an inquisition." Henry turned back to her, eyes sharp now, accusing. "You went to Calder. You didn't mention it. You knew about the clause in my father's will. Tell me, did they send you?" Clara's face tightened, but she didn't flinch. "No, I went there looking for work. for donations to the shelter project. They rejected me. Convenient story. No, she said, standing now too. It's just the truth. The room felt smaller. The farmhouse that had once offered quiet now throbbed with tension. Clara's voice softened, but there was steel underneath. You're afraid, she said. Henry froze, afraid to let anyone matter again. She continued. And maybe I get that. Maybe I've done the same. But if you're going to turn every piece of my past into a weapon, then we were never really partners to begin with. He didn't speak, didn't move, because part of him wanted to believe her, and part of him couldn't afford to. Clara reached for her bag. He didn't stop her. At the door, she turned. I told you in the beginning I had reasons. I also told you I wouldn't lie. But it's easier to believe I'm the villain than admit you might be wrong again. Isn't it? Henry didn't reply. She stepped out into the morning light, and this time, the silence she left behind wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. He stayed in the farmhouse alone for another day, maybe two. The hours blurred. Each corner of the house now felt like it had her fingerprints on it, the curve of her cup on the counter, the faint smell of her shampoo on the blanket she left folded on the chair. He walked into the barn once, stared at the old sketchbooks, then closed them again. He didn't draw. He didn't sleep much either, because every time he closed his eyes, he saw the way Clara looked at him before she left, not angry, not defensive, just tired. Tired of not being trusted. Tired of trying to prove she wasn't the enemy. And what if she wasn't? What if the only one sabotaging this was him? The days after Clara left passed like fog, thick, quiet, impossible to move through without getting lost in it. Henry returned to Asheville, but the city felt hollow. His penthouse, though spotless, echoed with a strange emptiness. Every object felt slightly out of place. The couch too neat, the books too aligned, the silence too loud. He hadn't called her. He didn't know what he would say if he did, that he was sorry, that he had let his fear speak louder than his heart, or worse, that he still didn't know if he could believe her. Eleanor Hart stepped into his office on the third morning back. She carried two things: a folder and a look that could melt steel. You look like hell, she said flatly. Henry didn't glance up. Thank you for the sentiment. She dropped the folder on his desk. That's the security report you asked for, on Clara Monroe. He froze. His fingers hovered above the manila flap, but didn't open it. Eleanor crossed her arms. I didn't read it, she said. Didn't want to lose what little respect I still have for you. He looked up slowly. You're not paid to like me. No, she said, voice sharper now. I'm paid to protect the company, but sometimes that means protecting you from yourself. Henry didn't respond. Eleanor sighed. The edge in her tone softened. Just slightly. You keep punishing the present for what the past did to you, she said. One day, there won't be anything left but empty rooms and regrets. She walked out without another word. The folder remained unopened. For now, across town, Clara sat in a modest studio apartment she hadn't visited in months. The walls were bare. A lone plant leaned toward the window, reaching for sunlight that barely arrived. She had packed light when she left the farmhouse. 2 changes of clothes, her mother's bracelet, and one sketch Henry had accidentally left behind, a half-drawn coat design on craft paper. She didn't know why she kept it. Maybe because it reminded her that before he became cold, Henry had been an artist. Or maybe because, despite the pain, some part of her still believed in what they had begun to build. She got an email the next afternoon from the board, a reminder of the scheduled winter collection launch gala still set for next week. Her name was still on the guest list. So was her photograph. She stared at the screen, hand frozen over the trackpad. It would be easy to ignore it, walk away, pretend none of it had mattered. But something in her whispered, you don't get to disappear just because you're hurt. And so, Clara opened her notebook, turned to a blank page, began sketching, not for the company, not for Henry, not for anyone else, just for herself. Back in his office, Henry finally opened the folder. The report was detailed, cold, background, employment, Travel history, witness interviews, nothing scandalous, no payments from Calder, no connections to competitors, just one note near the end that made his pulse stumble. Subject previously contacted Calder Textiles, seeking support for a shelter for single mothers in South Carolina. Request was denied, no further interactions recorded. The words blurred slightly as he stared. She'd told the truth, every word of it, and he'd thrown it back in her face. Henry leaned back in his chair, for the first time in years, his eyes closed, not in exhaustion, but in quiet shame. That night, he returned to the farmhouse, alone. The house hadn't changed. The light still flickered on the porch. The wind still rattled the shutters. Inside, the blanket she had used still lay folded on the couch. He didn't touch it, just sat beside it, and whispered into the dark, "I wanted to trust you." He didn't expect an answer, but somehow the silence felt softer, like maybe it forgave him, even if she hadn't yet. It was tucked between the pages of a sketchbook. Henry hadn't planned to open it. He was just wandering aimlessly, hopelessly through the old farmhouse after yet another sleepless night. The rain tapped gently on the windows, and the silence inside pressed in around him like an old coat. He pulled the sketchbook down absent-mindedly, letting it fall open in his hands. That's when he saw it. A single folded page, faintly creased, unlabeled, unassuming. Just her handwriting on the front. "If you ever decide to listen." His breath caught. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where they had once shared tea and too much silence. With trembling fingers, he opened the letter and began to read. "Dear Henry, I never meant to leave like that, not with everything unsaid. But I could see it in your eyes, that line between fear and anger, drawn so tight it might tear you in half. And I didn't want to be the reason you shattered. So I walked. Not to punish you, but to protect what was left of both of us." Henry paused. The words blurred slightly. His hand tightened around the page. He swallowed once, then kept reading. "I told you once I had my reasons for saying yes to this deal. What I didn't tell you was what it cost me. For the first time in years, I had started to hope again. You made me remember what it felt like to be seen not for what I lacked, but for what I carried. I know trust is a difficult thing for you. I know someone before me broke something sacred, but I am not Eliza. I never wanted your company. I just wanted to matter to someone who had forgotten how to believe in mattering." He exhaled sharply, hand covering his mouth. He didn't realize he'd stopped breathing until then. "I didn't come to steal. I came because your father gave my mother a second chance. And I came because, maybe, in some impossible way, I thought I could give one to you, but you weren't ready. And maybe I wasn't either. Still, I want you to know this. I didn't lie. I didn't leave to hurt you. I left so that you could decide without noise, without pressure, without fear what you really want." At the bottom of the page, in smaller script, "Sometimes love isn't loud. Sometimes it waits in quiet places until someone is ready to come find it." Henry lowered the letter. The rain outside had stopped. The silence inside had changed. It no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like an invitation. That evening, Henry returned to the penthouse in Asheville. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat by the window, the city glowing beneath him, and read the letter again, every word, twice. Then he did something unexpected. He picked up a pencil, pulled out the sketch pad, and began to draw, not a product, not a coat, not something for PR. He drew her hands, the way they had moved when she worked with fabric, the curve of her fingers, the steadiness they carried, and in the margins, without thinking, he wrote, "Come back." He emailed Eleanor the next morning, "Find her." He typed, "No press, no pressure, just ask her if she'd be willing to talk." Eleanor replied with one line, "Already on it." Henry sat back. For the first time in months, he felt like something inside him had shifted, not healed, not fixed, but willing. It started with a name, Clara's mother, Eva Monroe. Henry hadn't thought much about her before. She had only been mentioned once or twice quietly, almost reverently, in Clara's stories. But now, he needed to know more. Not out of suspicion, but something deeper, something like atonement. He called Eleanor. Find every employment record you can on Eva Monroe, he said. Start with Charleston. Go back 20 years if you have to. Eleanor didn't ask questions, just replied with her usual calm. On it. Within 24 hours, the file came through. Eva Monroe, factory worker at a textile mill in Charleston, worked 12-hour shifts, fired without severance after a machinery accident, hospitalized, no union support. Months of silence until one incident changed the trajectory of her life. A handwritten note of intervention, signed Charles Whitmore, Henry's father. His throat tightened as he stared at the scanned copy. There it was, his father's unmistakable handwriting. The same man Henry had once believed had cared more about legacy than people shown now in a single, quiet act of kindness. Eva, no one should be treated this way. Come to Asheville. There's work for you here. We'll take care of it together. C.W. And she had come, not for charity, but for dignity. And Clara. Clara had been that little girl following her mother into the back entrance of Whitmore & Co., watching her rebuild a life from nothing. She didn't owe me anything, Henry thought. She just wanted me to know where I came from. It hit him like a punch to the chest. All the things he hadn't seen, all the things he'd refused to see. He had looked at Clara and seen only risk. She had looked at him and somehow seen the man he could be. Later that afternoon, he drove. No driver, no phone calls, no itinerary. He drove 3 hours south to Charleston, not to track Clara down. He didn't even know if she was there, but to find the shelter she had once mentioned. It wasn't easy to locate. It had no website, no donor wall, just a weathered sign, the Willow House for Women Starting Over. Henry parked outside and stared for a long time. Inside, a woman with graying hair greeted him at the desk. She smiled, kindly, but cautiously. I'm looking for someone, he said, Clara Monroe. The woman's expression softened. She hasn't been here in weeks, but she helped design the place. She used to sit in that corner with a notebook, drawing where the beds should go. Henry followed her glance. A sunlit corner, quiet. A single wooden chair and a vase with dried lavender. She never asked for recognition, the woman said. Only that we let the women feel safe. Henry's voice was rough. Did she ever talk about me? The woman smiled, faintly. She didn't need to. He left a donation on the desk anonymous, then stepped back outside into the late afternoon light. She was building something long before I showed up, he thought, and I tried to make her small enough to fit into my narrative. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had built a company, signed contracts, drawn thousands of designs. But for the first time, they felt unsteady, not because he was breaking, but because maybe he was beginning to come undone in the right way. That night, Henry returned to the farmhouse once more. He opened the barn, sat at the work table, pulled out the sketch of Clara's hand, laid it beside an old, worn-out design, the one he had drawn years ago but never finished, and began to sketch again, not for business, not for press, but for the woman who had once sat across from him in silence and made that silence feel like home. The knock came just after sundown, soft, not urgent, but enough to stir Henry from where he sat in the old farmhouse, beside the fireplace now flickering with a quiet flame. He hesitated. No one came here uninvited. When he opened the door, she was there, Clara, hair slightly damp from the mist, a wool coat buttoned up to her collarbone, a worn canvas bag on one shoulder, and in her eyes, not accusation, not anger, just presence, like she had come not to confront, but to complete something unfinished. Hi, she said simply. Henry's breath caught, not because he didn't expect her, but because, somehow, she still took him by surprise. They sat across from each other in the kitchen, 2 mugs of tea between them, the room quiet except for the steady hum of the kettle still cooling on the stove. No one spoke for a long time. Then Clara broke the silence. You found the letter? He nodded. I read it twice. He said, then again this morning. She looked down, her fingers wrapped around the mug like she was trying to keep her hands from trembling. I didn't write it to ask for anything, she said, only to leave the door open. Henry's voice was low, steady. I closed that door too quickly. Clara didn't interrupt. He continued, softer now. I thought I was protecting myself, but all I was doing was punishing you for someone else's betrayal. She looked up, slowly. That's not your fault, she said gently. No, Henry replied, but what I did with that fear was... He stood, walked to the fireplace, then turned back to face her. I went to Charleston, he said. I know, she said. Eleanor told me. I saw Willow House. I saw what you built. Clara didn't say anything. I also saw a little corner, he added, with a chair and lavender in a vase. Her lips curved slightly. That was my mother's favorite scent. Henry took a breath, one of those deep, uncertain ones that made the chest ache just before speaking truth. I never really knew my father, he admitted, not beyond the business. But that note, what he wrote to your mother, it made me realize something. Clara tilted her head. That the legacy he left wasn't just about profits or control. Henry said, it was about people. He stepped closer. And you reminded me of that. Not because you tried to impress me, but because you never did. A long pause. Clara's eyes searched his. So, what now? She asked. Henry moved to the table, sat across from her. We stopped pretending, he said. No more staged photos, no contracts, no deadlines. She looked wary, guarded still, but something shifted in her posture. And what would this be instead? Henry held her gaze. Real. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a sketch, the one he had drawn of her hands. I kept this, he said, because it reminded me that you create without needing recognition. He placed it gently in front of her. And because I want to start building something that doesn't require cameras to be seen. Clara's voice caught. You don't have to prove anything. I'm not, Henry said. I'm inviting you. She smiled then. It wasn't wide, but it was warm, the kind of smile that grows from beneath the weight of grief and forgiveness and still dares to bloom. They didn't kiss, not yet. They just sat there, drinking tea that had long since gone cold. And for the first time in a long time, silence felt like something sacred, something earned, something shared. They didn't plan a ceremony. There were no strings of lights, no pressed suits or tulle dresses, no aisle, no altar, no audience. Just Henry, Clara, and a farmhouse that had finally learned to breathe again. The legal contract had expired a week ago. Henry hadn't renewed it. Neither had Clara. They both knew what it meant. This time, if they stood together, it wouldn't be because of a clause in a will. It would be because they chose to. The air was cool that evening. A late winter breeze passed through the porch as Clara stood outside, barefoot, her toes brushing the wood, her arms wrapped in one of Henry's sweaters. Inside, the old record player spun a jazz tune neither of them could name. Henry stepped beside her, carrying 2 mugs of cocoa. No champagne, she teased. I like things that warm you from the inside, he replied. They sipped quietly. Clara looked out toward the trees, the last bit of snow melting beneath their branches. I used to dream of weddings, she said softly, when I was younger. But they were always loud, big, glittering. Henry tilted his head, and now she smiled. Now, I think I prefer what doesn't sparkle, but stays. He nodded, slowly. I didn't think I'd ever be the kind of man someone would stay for. You are, she said, without hesitation. Not because you changed for me, but because you let yourself change. Henry turned to face her. I want to marry you, he said, plain and quiet, like a truth long overdue. Not to save a company, not to fulfill a legacy, but because when you walked into my office that night, I think a part of me knew. Clara searched his face. You're serious? I'm terrified, he replied. She reached for his hand. So am I. They married the next day, a justice of the peace, a small courthouse in Asheville. Clara wore a navy dress. Henry wore the same tie he wore the day he signed the original contract. It felt right, imperfect, real. Afterward, They drove without a map until they found a quiet overlook above the river. The world was muted in gold and gray, and the sky stretched wide and silent above them. Henry turned to her. "You know we'll fight," he said. "We'll fail at some things." Clara nodded. "But we won't pretend." He smiled, then wide and true, the kind that cracked through years of silence. And she leaned in, finally, closing the distance between them. Their kiss wasn't staged. It wasn't part of a performance. It was messy, honest, a little off-center, and absolutely perfect. That night, back at the farmhouse, they shared dinner by candlelight, not because it was romantic, but because the electricity flickered out halfway through cooking. They laughed. They burned the bread. They danced barefoot in the kitchen to music from a phone speaker. At one point, Henry pulled Clara close, forehead resting against hers. "I used to think forever was just a word people used when they didn't know what else to promise." She smiled. And now he exhaled, pulling her tighter. "Now, I think it's the only thing I want to learn how to mean." Outside, the wind softened. Inside, two hearts stopped pretending. They weren't perfect, but they were real, and that was more than enough. They didn't return to the spotlight. There were no press releases, no carefully posed couple portraits in glossy magazines, just a quiet shift. Within a few months, changes began to echo inside Whitmore & Co., not in branding, but in how people were treated. Interns were offered real mentorship. Single mothers were given paid leave. The textile mill in Charleston, once shuttered by corporate decisions, was reopened with a new name, the Monroe Studio, where hands stitched not just garments, but second chances. Clara never asked for credit, but people knew. They always do, when something truly good begins to grow. Henry no longer wore power like armor. He still wore suits sharp, tailored, but his eyes had softened. His voice lowered. His door, once always closed, now often stayed open. One day, a young designer left a sketch on his desk with a note. "This wouldn't exist without what you and Clara made space for." He kept that note in his wallet. Every Friday afternoon, they returned to the farmhouse. It became their sanctuary, a place where phones were turned off, where Clara planted lavender in the old garden, where Henry painted in a studio they rebuilt from the barn's broken beams. Sometimes, they said nothing for hours, and somehow, it felt like the deepest kind of conversation. One autumn evening, Henry stood watching the fire crackle as Clara folded blankets nearby. "Do you think we'll mess this up?" he asked. Clara smiled without looking up. "Probably. Many times." He chuckled. "I'm serious." She turned to him then, eyes warm. "I didn't marry a perfect man. I married a man willing to grow." He crossed the room and kissed her forehead. "Then I'll never stop growing." On the 1-year anniversary of the original contract, Clara framed it, the legal agreement. 12 pages, faded ink, signed with doubt and distance. Underneath it, she placed a small plaque. "This is how we pretended. That's how we began. But this is how we stayed." It hung in Henry's office, right next to a photograph of the Willow House's grand reopening. When a journalist reached out for a retrospective feature from paper to partnership, the Whitmore marriage story, they politely declined. Instead, they submitted a statement. Some stories don't need to be told through headlines. They're better lived quietly, consistently, and with more truth than performance allows. The article never ran. But the world still noticed, because when people lead with empathy, when companies choose people over performance, the effect ripples. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand attention. It simply lasts. And perhaps that was the greatest legacy of all. Not a billion-dollar brand, not a boardroom victory, not even a love story that bloomed from a contract, but a simple truth that people can change, that healing is possible, and that sometimes what starts as survival becomes something worth staying for. Sometimes, love doesn't begin with fireworks. It begins with doubt, with silence, with two people who never expected to heal, much less together. Henry and Clara didn't fall in love the way movies tell us they should. They built it, one scar at a time. They chose each other not because it was easy, but because they saw past the roles, past the labels, past what the world expected them to be. And maybe that's the heart of it all, that behind every quiet soul is a story no one bothered to ask. That dignity should never depend on social class, gender, or legacy. That no one deserves to be judged for where they come from, only for how they choose to live. So, if this story moved something in you, even just a little, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs hope. Subscribe to our channel to keep walking with us through stories that heal, question, and connect. Because here at Shining Stories, we believe the most powerful stories are the ones that make us feel more human.